They called it family duty, but imagine overhearing your parents say your sister will handle the costs. She's too soft to refuse. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I went silent, and that silence became their undoing, because when the story broke, their names were everywhere, their lies laid bare, and as their empire crumbled, I realized revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simply speaks the truth. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The rain had that soft, steady rhythm that Portland was known for, the kind that makes the whole city smell like wet cedar and coffee. I had just finished another long day at Jefferson High, where spring break was the only thing keeping my students from losing their minds. My car was packed with graded essays, a half-eaten protein bar, and the old wristwatch Dad had asked me to take in for repair last month. I figured I'd drop it off on my way home. Their house sat at the top of a curved street in West Hills, where the trees seemed to arch over the road, like they were guarding something. Every time I pulled into that driveway, I felt the same mix of nostalgia and unease, like coming home to a place that used to love you but forgot how. The house hadn't changed. 2 stories, dark wood trim, white columns, and Mom's favorite lilac bushes blooming by the porch. Even through the rain, I could hear the faint sound of her piano through the window, that same repetitive tune she always played when she was nervous. I knocked once before letting myself in. Mom. Dad. My voice echoed down the hallway, but no one answered. The air smelled like lemon polish and the faint sweetness of Mom's perfume. I was halfway down the corridor when I heard Dad's voice from his study, firm, low, the same tone he used when discussing clients. "Mark, don't worry about the expenses," he said. "The wedding is a reflection of our family's reputation. Your sister will cover everything." I froze. For a second, I wasn't sure if I'd heard him right. My brother's voice came next, lighter, cautious. "Dad, I don't want to put that kind of pressure on Emily. It's not—" "Don't be sentimental," Dad cut in. "You've worked hard for this. She owes it to us. She'll never say no." Mom's voice slipped in then, smooth as always, but edged with something sharp. "She needs to learn gratitude, Richard. After everything we've done for her, paying for her brother's wedding is the least she can do." The words hit me in slow motion. Each one landed heavy, pressing into my chest. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Mark's tone softened. "I just don't want her to feel used. She's been struggling with her loans and—" "She'll be fine," Dad snapped. "She's always fine. She chose that job. She can live with the consequences." This wedding isn't up for debate. There was a pause long enough that I could hear the rain tapping against the window panes. Then Mom said quietly, "She should be grateful she even has a family to stand beside." I don't remember breathing. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag until my knuckles went white. Every instinct told me to burst through the door and scream. Tell them how many times I'd stayed quiet, how many times I'd swallowed my pride just to keep the peace. But instead, I stepped back. I moved slowly down the hall, careful not to make a sound, my heartbeat so loud it drowned out the piano. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The urge to turn around and confront them pulsed in my chest like static. But something colder took over. I left the house without saying a word. The rain had picked up the sky, dimming into that deep Oregon gray. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. My hands were trembling, but my mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in years. I turned on my phone and opened my banking app. My savings account balance blinked back at me. $46,000. The one thing I'd managed to hold on to after years of paying student loans and living paycheck to paycheck. I scrolled through the recent activity and my stomach twisted. Payments to the Shoreline venue, Santa Monica, another to Eterna Bridal. Thousands of dollars gone in a single week. I laughed, once, dry and humorless. I grabbed my laptop from the back seat, tethered my phone, and logged into the bank's secure portal. My fingers didn't shake anymore. They moved quickly, automatically. Within minutes, I transferred every cent of my savings into a new account I'd opened last month after Ryan suggested I diversify my funds. I remembered teasing him for being paranoid. The screen showed transfer complete. I stared at those 2 words until they blurred. Outside, the rain was falling harder, streaking the windshield like gray silk. Through the fogged glass, I could still see the faint glow of the house I'd just left. Mom's piano carried through the night again. Muffled and steady, the same song she used to play when I was a child. Before I learned that love could have conditions, I leaned back in the seat, listening to the sound fade. My breath fogged the glass. My heart was steady now, not angry, not broken, just still. "They want me to pay," I whispered to the empty car. "They'll get what they deserve, just not the way they think." The rain kept falling soft but relentless, until the house lights disappeared behind a curtain of gray. I started the engine, the hum of the car filling the silence, and drove away from the only home I'd ever had, leaving behind the music, the lies, and the version of myself that still cared to be their daughter. When I was 10, I used to sit by the big bay window in our old living room and watch the rain slide down the glass in long, crooked lines. Dad would come home smelling like his office, ink paper and cologne, and drop his briefcase by the couch. He'd loosen his tie, pour himself a drink, and call out for Mom. That night, I remember his voice echoing through the hallway, proud and booming. "Our boy did it. Mark's been chosen for the district's Outstanding Student Award." Mom gasped like he'd just announced they'd won the lottery. She set down her teacup, eyes glowing, and said, "I always knew he was special." Then she turned to me, the smile still there, but softer now. "Emily, you should try to study a little more like your brother. He sets such a good example." I nodded, pretending not to care. I looked back out at the rain, tracing a drop with my finger until it disappeared into the sill. That was the first time I remember feeling invisible in my own family. Dinner in the Carson household always followed a rhythm one I could recite in my sleep. Dad talked about interest rates and economic trends. Mom about her piano students and neighbors. Mark about his achievements. My role was to listen and nod to laugh when the timing seemed right. I never realized that staying quiet was something I'd become good at. Years later, when I was 24, Dad called me to his office downtown. His tone was warm, familiar, almost tender. "It's just a small favor," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "A short-term business loan for the company. I just need a co-signer." I hesitated, flipping through the papers. The numbers blurred together. "Dad, I don't really understand this stuff. Maybe Mark should." "Mark's too busy," he cut in. "And you're good with numbers, aren't you? You've been working in accounting for 2 years now? Besides, this is family. If you trust me, sign it." He smiled like it was nothing. I signed. A year later, the company went under. I found out from a notice in the mail. I called him that night, confused, terrified. He said only one thing. "It's handled." And then he hung up. We never spoke about it again. That was the day I learned silence could be used as a weapon, sometimes the kind that cuts the person who stays quiet. I quit my accounting job a few months later. I told people I wanted something more meaningful, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't stand looking at numbers that only reminded me how easily trust could be quantified and erased. I applied to teach math at Jefferson High, and when they offered me the position, I took it without a second thought. Teaching paid less, but it felt like freedom. For a while, I believed that walking away from money meant walking away from pain. But pain has a funny way of following you home. It was a Thursday afternoon just before final exams. The classroom smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old coffee. My students were taking turns reading their essays aloud, their teenage voices shaky but hopeful. Outside, the rain had returned. Soft, steady, like a memory that refused to leave. As one of my students, a shy girl named Lily, read her paper about what home means, I found myself staring out the window again. The clouds over Portland hung low the same way they had when I was a kid. I could almost see my reflection in the glass. Older now, quieter, but still waiting for someone to notice her. Lily's voice faded. "Ms. Carson, are you okay?" I blinked, forced a smile. Just thinking. Keep going. That was really good. She smiled, and the class moved on, but inside I felt that same old ache, the one that came whenever I remembered Dad's voice. Not the words, but the tone. Calm, professional, like I was another employee in his company. The bell rang, and the students scattered, leaving behind papers and laughter. I sat at my desk, surrounded by silence and half-graded assignments. I turned on my laptop, ready to lose myself in work, when a notification appeared in the corner of the screen. An email from my bank. Subject line transaction confirmation. My pulse quickened. I clicked it open. Your payment of $18,043 to the Shoreline Resort, Santa Monica, has been successfully processed. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. The resort, the wedding, my name on the account. A chill spread through my chest, not fear exactly, but something heavier, deeper, a realization settling into my bones. I looked at the date on the transaction. 2 days ago. They hadn't wasted any time. I scrolled through my previous emails, searching for something, anything that would prove it was a mistake. But there was nothing. Just silence. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft but deliberate. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. The room felt smaller, tighter. My breathing slowed. I thought about the girl by the window, tracing raindrops, trying not to feel forgotten. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like her anymore. I wasn't invisible now. I was awake. The rain began to drum harder against the glass, and I whispered to no one. So this is how it starts. The computer screen dimmed automatically, but I kept staring at my reflection in it, a woman who'd finally stopped asking to be seen. The next morning, I walked into the downtown branch of Northwest Federal with a tightness in my chest that no amount of coffee could ease. The air smelled like disinfectant and printer ink, too clean for how dirty I felt inside. I sat across from a young banker named Olivia, her smile polite and professional, her keyboard clacking as she pulled up my account. "Can you confirm the transaction date again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, eyes scanning the screen. Yes, the authorization for the Shoreline Resort in Santa Monica was signed and verified 3 weeks ago. Signature matches the one we have on file. 3 weeks ago, I was in my classroom giving midterm exams. Olivia looked up, clearly uncomfortable. I understand, Ms. Carson, but it's the same digital signature we use for your account. Unless you've shared your access or there's been an internal error, it would appear valid. I stared at her. So you're saying I paid $18,000 for a wedding I wasn't invited to? Her cheeks flushed pink. I'm not saying that, but if you believe there's been fraud, you can file a formal dispute. It may take several weeks to investigate. Several weeks. By then, my parents would probably have moved on to charging the next expense under my name. I thanked her, signed the initial paperwork, and stepped back into the gray drizzle outside. The city felt different, colder, sharper, like the buildings themselves were leaning in to listen. I stood under the awning, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to the one contact I'd avoided since the loan disaster years ago. Claire Dalton. She answered on the second ring. Emily Carson. It's been a while. Her voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that made you feel like chaos could be managed with enough paperwork. I need help, I said. Legal help. Tell me everything. By noon, I was sitting in her small office near Pioneer Square. The walls were lined with books and framed certificates, the blinds half drawn against the weak daylight. Claire wore a gray blazer, her hair pulled back in a knot, reading glasses perched on her nose as she flipped through the printed contract Olivia had emailed over. If this signature isn't yours, she said, tapping the page, then what we have here is identity fraud and potentially financial coercion. 2 separate federal violations. I took a slow breath. What do I do? First, we gather proof. Every transaction, every login, every document. Don't contact your parents or your brother yet. The less they know you're aware, the better. Fraud cases hinge on intent, and right now we need them to show theirs. Her confidence steadied me. I nodded. Okay. Second, she continued. I'll file a soft inquiry with the fraud department. It won't alert the other party yet. You'll also want to change your passwords and secure your accounts. We'll need the timestamps of when these payments were initiated. I spent the next hour scrolling through my bank statements while Claire typed notes. My anger simmered quietly, not fiery, but cold, focused. Each payment told a story: bridal boutique catering service, luxury transport. Each one authorized from the Carson household IP address. When we finished, I left her office with a folder of documents under my arm and a strange calm in my chest, the kind that comes when you've decided not to be helpless anymore. By evening, I was back in my apartment downtown. The rain had eased, but the air still smelled of it, wet asphalt steel, and the faint sweetness of the bakery across the street. I changed into an oversized sweater, made tea, and sat on the floor surrounded by papers. The clock ticked. Midnight came and went. I printed statements, highlighted dates, and created a timeline of every unauthorized withdrawal. Each red mark on the paper felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they had taken. Around 1 a.m., my phone buzzed. Ryan's name lit up the screen. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and groggy. "You sound wired. What's going on?" They forged my signature. Ryan. The wedding bills, the resort, everything. My parents used my name. There was silence on the line. "Then Jesus, Em, have you confronted them?" "No, not yet. I'm meeting with a lawyer. She said to stay quiet." "That's smart," he said. "If you go after them now, they'll cover their tracks. Listen, lock your credit, freeze your cards, all of them. And don't tell them anything. The quieter you are, the more they'll assume you're still in the dark." His voice had that firm, analytical edge, the financial advisor tone that used to annoy me when we first started dating. Tonight, it sounded like protection. "Thanks," I whispered. "Emily," he added, voice softer, "how you don't owe them your silence anymore. This time, it's yours to use however you want." After the call, I sat by the window, the city lights blurring through the condensation. I opened the voice memo app on my phone and hit record. I used to think silence meant surrender, that keeping peace was strength. But silence can also be a blade if you learn where to aim. My voice sounded foreign to me. Steady, detached, almost dangerous. I closed the app, leaned my head against the glass, and watched the empty streets. The rain started again, light but endless, washing everything clean. Just before I went to bed, my phone vibrated one last time. It was a message from Claire. "I know someone at the Portland Police Department, Detective Jason Lee. He specializes in financial crimes. He can take a look discreetly." I stared at the message for a long time, then typed back a single line. "Do it." Outside, thunder rolled again, faint but promising, like the sound of something about to break. By Saturday evening, the rain had cleared, leaving the streets slick and shining beneath the orange glow of the streetlights. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for nearly 5 minutes before I forced myself to get out. Their windows glowed warm against the cool Portland night, silhouettes moving behind the curtains, familiar shapes that once meant home. I smoothed my hair, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and reminded myself that tonight I wasn't the daughter who apologized. I was the observer. When Mom opened the door, the scent of rosemary and roasted lamb flooded out. "Emily," she said, smiling too wide, her lipstick perfect, her voice pitched an octave higher than usual. "You're right on time." "Traffic was light," I said, stepping inside. The living room was glowing. Candles, jazz music, crystal glasses lined up like soldiers on the sideboard. Dad was already in his chair, swirling a glass of Cabernet like he was preparing for a toast. "Mark and Sophia just got here," Mom said, leading me toward the dining room. The table was set for 6. Fine china linen napkins, name cards. Always an event, never a meal. Sophia stood at the end of the table in a sleek white dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She smiled, perfect and polite. "Emily." "You look lovely." "Thanks," I said, taking my seat. Dinner started like theater. Mom and Sophia discussed floral arrangements and color palettes for the wedding. Peonies versus roses, champagne versus white wine. Each topic treated with the same gravity as a political summit. Dad jumped in between bites of lamb. "I told the club we're hosting the rehearsal dinner there. The Carsons always do things properly. Our family knows how to stand tall." I nodded, my fork moving through the food like an afterthought. They were all performing, each line rehearsed, each smile strategic. Mark caught my eye once, offering a half smile that said, "Hang in there." He'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who wanted everyone to get along, even when that meant pretending nothing was wrong. "You know, Emily," he said gently. "They just want what's best for everyone." I set down my fork. "I know." Mom looked up from her wine. "Then show it. Smile a little, dear. People can sense misery, and it's not flattering on anyone, especially at family gatherings." Her tone was sugar-coated, but I could hear the venom underneath. The room went quiet. Even Dad looked at her like she'd gone too far. I turned toward her slowly, meeting her gaze. "You're right, Mom. I'll try to smile more." My voice was calm, controlled, too calm, the kind of calm that makes people uneasy. She blinked, unsure how to respond. The silence stretched. Jazz hummed softly in the background, the saxophone filling the cracks between us. Dad cleared his throat. "Let's focus on the good things," he said, standing to pour more wine. He set a thick envelope beside my plate. "Before I forget, can you sign this, sweetheart? It's just to confirm your part in the wedding expenses. A simple formality for the venue." "A formality?" My fingers itched to grab the envelope and tear it apart in front of them, to expose them for what they were doing. Instead, I reached for it slowly, tucking it into my bag with a faint smile. "I'll look it over tonight," I said. Good girl, he replied, already turning back to refill his glass. Mark tried to shift the conversation. Sophia and I are finalizing the guest list this week. I think you'll love the location. It overlooks the ocean. I'm sure it's beautiful, I said. Everything you do always is. My tone was light, but my hands trembled beneath the table. For the rest of dinner, I said little. They talked about vacations, golf tournaments, new neighbors. I studied the room, the framed family portraits, the glint of silverware under the chandelier. For a moment, it was as if I were watching strangers through a window, not sitting among them. After dessert, Mom hugged me at the door. You'll see, darling, she said softly. This wedding will bring the family closer together. Maybe, I said, or maybe it'll just show us who we really are. She laughed lightly, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. I walked to my car, heels clicking against the driveway, the envelope heavy in my purse. Inside, I could hear the faint echo of laughter, the sound of glasses clinking. A perfect little show. Once I was seated, I turned on the dome light and pulled the envelope out. My name was typed neatly on the front in Dad's handwriting. I tore it open carefully, unfolding the crisp papers inside. It was an invoice from the Shoreline Resort. $58,000, paid under my name. My signature forged again, this time bolder, more confident, like they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The anger that rose in me wasn't the sharp, shaking kind. It was cold, precise. I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo of every page, and attached them in an email to Claire with a short message. Found something new. Proof. I hit send, then stared at the paper in my hands for a long moment before folding it back into the envelope. They thought I'd crumble. They thought that if they smiled wide enough and poured enough wine, I'd keep playing my part, but the truth was simple. I wasn't the girl they'd trained me to be anymore. I slipped the envelope back into my bag, started the car, and backed out of the driveway. Through the rearview mirror, I watched the house grow smaller behind me. The warm lights, the sound of jazz fading into nothing. They thought I was weak. I'd just learned how not to show them I was strong. Monday morning came gray and damp, the kind of Portland morning where the clouds felt too low, pressing against the rooftops like they were trying to listen in. I parked in front of Claire's office, holding a folder thick with printouts. Bank statements, contracts, screenshots, every piece of paper that proved my family had turned me into a funding source. Claire's door opened before I even knocked. He's already here, she said quietly. Inside, a man in a dark jacket was sitting across from her desk. He looked mid-40s, calm eyes. The sort of face that could tell bad news without flinching. He stood when I entered. Detective Jason Lee, he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, professional. I specialize in financial fraud and identity theft. Claire filled me in. I sat down, sliding the folder across the desk. Everything's in there. My bank confirmed the payments were authorized under my name. The signature matches an old version of my digital file. It wasn't me. Jason flipped through the pages, eyes scanning fast. This is enough to raise suspicion. The tricky part is proving intent. Did your parents have access to your digital credentials? They had copies of my tax information. And they've used my old digital forms before. He nodded, jotting a note. That's common in family-based cases. If you'd like, I can open an internal review. Quietly. No formal complaint yet, just a cross-check of where and when these transactions were made. It won't alert them. That's what I want, I said. I don't want them to know I'm fighting back. Not yet, Jason gave a faint, understanding smile. You're doing the right thing. Silence can be leverage. He gathered the documents, stacked them neatly. I'll contact the fraud division at Northwest Federal. If there's a pattern, same IP address, same logins, we'll see it. Claire leaned back, watching me carefully. Emily, this will take time. You'll need to keep your day-to-day life as normal as possible. Normal, I said, half a laugh. I can do that. That afternoon, I went back to school. The hallways smelled like pencil shavings and floor wax, the usual chaos of teenagers trying to outshout one another. It grounded me. In my classroom, I wrote equations on the board while students argued about group projects. For a few hours, I almost forgot about contracts and forged signatures. At the end of the day, one of my students, Lily, the quiet one who sat in the front row, walked up to my desk. She held out a small braided bracelet, the kind made of colored strings. I made this for you, she said shyly. You're always so calm, even when everything's crazy. My mom says calm people always win in the end. I smiled, taking it. Your mom's right. Sometimes being calm is the only way to win. She grinned and ran out before I could say more. I tied the bracelet loosely around my wrist. The colors, blue, white, gray, almost matched the clouds outside. When I got home that night, the apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge. I made tea and opened my laptop trying to mark essays, but my mind kept drifting. Around 10, my phone buzzed. A new email from the bank. Notice of new balance due, $85,000. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. A new account, new charges, this time for event coordination services and luxury transport. My stomach twisted, but my mind stayed still. They thought I was cornered. I set the mug down, carefully opened my notebook, and began writing the timeline again. Every date, every payment, every location. I highlighted the new transactions in red. My handwriting didn't even shake. They thought they were tightening the noose. What they didn't know was that I'd already stepped out of it. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Ryan. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I typed back. "Quiet, just the way I need to be." He replied with a single word, "Good." I stared at the word for a while before closing my laptop. I sat in the dark, the city outside painted in reflections from passing headlights. The sound of rain started again, faint against the windows. I spoke softly, almost to myself. They think I'm stuck, but all they've done is show me where the exits are. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated once more. A message from Claire. From Claire Dalton. Subject, update from Jason. Text, "We found it. Original contract on file. Signature is forged. Same timestamp, same IP as previous transactions. Jason says we'll have a full report soon. There will be consequences." I read the message twice, then leaned back against the couch. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe deeply. The city outside was still gray, still wet, but somehow the air felt different, lighter. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the rain and thinking about what Jason had said. Silence can be leverage. And for the first time, I believed it. Mark called early Saturday morning, his voice tight and tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. "In person?" I hesitated before answering. "Where?" "There's that coffee place by the river. You know, the one with the blue umbrellas, 11 o'clock. When I got there, he was already waiting, hands wrapped around a paper cup, staring out at the gray water of the Willamette. The wind carried the smell of wet concrete and espresso. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just exhausted. He stood when he saw me. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Sure," I replied, taking the seat across from him. For a minute, we just listened to the hum of the espresso machine and the chatter of strangers. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You've really hurt them, Em." My eyes didn't leave his. "Hurt them." "How Mom's been crying for days," he said. "Dad barely sleeps. They don't understand why you're doing this. They just wanted to make sure things were handled for the wedding." I let out a soft laugh that didn't sound like one. If handled means using my name to take out credit and forge my signature, then yeah, they handled it pretty well. His jaw tightened. "You're twisting it. They didn't mean for it to go that far. You always—" He stopped himself, lowering his voice. "You always make yourself the victim. This family isn't trying to hurt you." The words hit like a slap, but I'd expected them. "You're right," I said quietly. "They're not trying. They don't have to try. It's second nature now." He frowned, looking down at his cup. "You know how Dad is. He's always been tough, but he's practical. And Mom, she just wants peace. She doesn't think about things the way you do. That's the problem, Mark. None of you think about things the way I do because none of you ever had to." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Em, this isn't good for anyone. Can't we just move past it? Move past fraud?" I asked. "Past the fact that they used my identity like a spare credit card." He looked away. The barista called an order. Steam hissed from the espresso machine, drowning out the silence that fell between us. "I don't want this to ruin everything," he said finally. "We're family." "Family," I repeated, almost whispering. "Family means you protect each other, Mark. Not that you look away while someone takes advantage of you because they share your last name." He swallowed hard, the words catching somewhere between guilt and denial. "You're angry right now. When this blows over, this won't blow over." I cut in, my tone steady. "It's not wind. It's fire." He stared at me, something like fear flickering behind his eyes. "I don't even know who you are anymore. Maybe you never did." The words hung in the air, final and heavy. Neither of us spoke for a long time. People came and went around us, their laughter floating in and out, the world oblivious to the quiet fracture happening at a small corner table by the river. Eventually I stood. "I don't want to make your life harder," I said softly, "but you should take a good look around Mark. Ask yourself who's really using who." He didn't look up. His hands gripped the cup so tightly I thought it might crack. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying mist off the water. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward my car. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was calm, almost too calm. At home, the apartment was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. I hung up my coat, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. The glow from the screen felt sharp against the dim light. I clicked through my folders until I found the one labeled personal. Inside were the voice recordings from that night, the one where I'd stood in the hallway and heard every word that tore down the last illusion I had about my family. I put on my headphones and listened again. Dad's voice calm and commanding. Mom's cool and deliberate. Mark's uncertain but complicit. The sound of my name said like an obligation. I closed my eyes, let it wash over me, and then hit pause. Then I began uploading the audio file, the photographs of the $58,000 invoice, the emails confirming transactions. Each piece fell into place like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. I attached everything to a single email to Claire. Subject line, additional documentation, message. Here's the recording I mentioned, also. Attaching proof of the resort payment and bank correspondence. This should fill the gaps. I hesitated before hitting send. Staring at my reflection in the screen, I didn't look like someone plotting revenge. I looked like someone reclaiming control. I pressed send. The screen flickered briefly as the message left my outbox. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a slow breath. Proof doesn't lie, but it speaks only for those who know when to stay quiet. The bracelet Lily had given me caught the light as I reached to close the laptop, its soft colors twisting around my wrist. I ran my thumb over the threads, feeling the small knots between them. Calm wasn't weakness. It was the sharpest edge I had. The sunlight in Santa Monica was almost too much sharp and golden, bouncing off the white stucco walls of the resort and turning everything into a picture-perfect scene. As the plane touched down, I looked out the window at the glittering coast and felt nothing. Not excitement, not dread, just stillness. I carried one suitcase, a single navy dress, my notebook, and a pair of worn heels. That was all I needed. The shoreline resort looked like something out of a magazine. Rows of palm trees lined the entrance, and staff in crisp uniforms handed out champagne to guests stepping out of black cars. My parents had spared no expense, which made sense. They weren't the ones paying. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with perfume laughter and the faint hum of string instruments. I caught my mother's eyes first. Eleanor stood near the center of the room, radiant in a soft gold dress surrounded by women she used to gossip about. When she saw me, her smile froze just slightly. Then, in one smooth motion, she adjusted her necklace and looked away. Dad was nearby talking to a local politician he admired. He saw me, gave a curt nod, and turned back to his conversation. To them, I was a necessary appearance, not a person. Mark and Sophia stood on a raised terrace, for photos glowing like a commercial for happiness. She looked flawless in her designer gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I sat in the last row of white chairs far enough back that no one had to acknowledge me. I watched as photographers clicked, as champagne flowed, as my family pretended everything was perfect. The ocean stretched out behind them, endless and indifferent. Around noon, I slipped out to the patio for air. The sound of waves below mingled with laughter from the reception. My phone buzzed in my clutch. Ava Coleman. The message was short. Story goes live in 30. You sure about this? I stared at it for a long moment. The breeze caught my hair, the smell of salt water sharp in the air. I typed back, "Do it. I'm only telling the truth." Then I turned my phone face down and went back inside. 30 minutes later, the ceremony was about to begin. Guests were filing into the open-air terrace, their chatter light and oblivious. A pianist began to play. Sophia stood behind the arch of flowers, her bridesmaids fixing her train. Mark looked out over the crowd, grinning nervously. Then it started. The first buzz of a phone, then another, and another. The sound spread like a ripple. People glanced down, whispering, showing screens to each other. I could almost feel the air change, a hush settling in that wasn't part of the ceremony. On every phone screen, the same headline from the Portland Tribune teacher. Forced to pay for millionaire brother's wedding. Family fraud under investigation. It hit like thunder. I stayed seated as heads turned, voices rose, and confusion spread through the rows. Mom's face went pale, her hand trembling as she tried to read the screen. Dad stiffened, jaw clenched, color draining from his cheeks. Sophia looked at Mark, who was already pulling his phone from his pocket. His smile vanished. He found me in the crowd almost immediately. His expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. He started toward me, but Dad grabbed his arm. "Stay put," he hissed. "Don't make a scene." It was already too late. The whispers had turned into a low roar. I stood smoothing the skirt of my dress, calm as ever. The pianist had stopped playing. The only sound was the ocean and the murmuring of guests. Dad broke first. He pushed through the rows of chairs and stopped in front of me, his voice low but shaking with fury. "What have you done?" "Nothing," I said softly. "I just stopped keeping secrets." He took a step closer. "You've humiliated this family." "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "You did that the day you forged my name. I just gave the truth a stage." Behind him, Mom was still trying to smile for the guests, her lips twitching as she told someone. "It's all a misunderstanding." Sophia's father whispered something to his wife, and they quietly excused themselves from the front row. The photographers stopped shooting. Mark finally broke free from Dad's grip and came toward me. His voice cracked, half whisper, half plea. "Emily." "What are you doing?" "This isn't you." "It is," I said. "You just never saw me clearly." He looked around at the guests, the murmurs, the phones held up like witnesses. "You could have come to me. You could have told me. I did." I said, "You didn't want to listen." For a moment, he looked like a child again, confused and small. Then Sophia appeared beside him, her perfect composure cracking. "You knew about this?" she asked him, voice cold. Mark shook his head. "No, God, no. Because your name's all over it," she snapped, thrusting her phone toward him. "Your family used your sister's accounts. Everyone's talking about it." He went silent. The truth had finally reached him in a way I never could. I turned to leave. I'd made my point. But Dad's voice stopped me. Louder this time, sharp enough to silence the crowd. "You've disgraced us, Emily. Do you understand what you've done?" I faced him, my voice calm but steady. "No, Dad, I understand what you did. You took my name, my money, and my trust. You made me the villain in a story I didn't write. Now you're just watching it get published." The wind picked up, lifting the petals from the flower arrangements and scattering them across the terrace. Guests began to stand, whispering, avoiding eye contact. The pianist quietly packed his sheet music. Mom finally turned, her voice trembling, but still clinging to pride. "Emily, please stop this madness. You're ruining your brother's wedding." I looked at her. "It was already ruined the day you made it my debt." For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched thin, humming with shame and disbelief. Then I walked away. The sound of the ocean followed me down the boardwalk, blending with the muffled chaos behind me. The voices, the questions, the shattering illusion of perfection. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. They had built their happiness on a lie. All I did was take away the mask. 2 days later, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Every major outlet had picked up Ava's article, each headline louder than the last. Banker and wife use daughter's identity to fund luxury wedding. Teacher exposes family fraud scandal. A perfect family falls apart in Santa Monica. By noon, it was everywhere. The story was on morning talk shows, podcasts, and even the trending page on Twitter. #CarsonFamily trailed behind celebrity gossip and political debates. The photos were impossible to avoid. My parents leaving the resort, faces hard and tight, followed by security. Mark and Sophia stepping into a black car, her expression unreadable. Ryan poured me a cup of coffee as I sat on his couch scrolling through comments. "You don't have to read those," he said softly. I know I murmured, but I kept scrolling anyway. Good for her. Finally, someone calls out this kind of abuse. That family's money can't buy them a conscience. For every cruel remark, there were 10 messages of support. Still, it didn't make me feel victorious. Just tired. Ryan sat beside me, his hand brushing mine. You did what you had to do. I didn't do anything I said. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's enough to start an earthquake, he said quietly. I turned off the phone, leaning back against the couch. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the gray Portland sky, but it felt hollow, like light in a hospital room. Later that afternoon, the television in Ryan's kitchen caught my attention. Eleanor Carson, my mother, was sitting in a news studio framed by soft lighting and sympathy. Her voice trembled as she dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said to the camera. "Families fight. Ours has had some disagreements, but nothing like what's being claimed." I stared at her through the screen. Her tears were real enough. She'd always been good at crying when she needed to. The reporter nodded, gentle, almost pitying. "So, you deny using your daughter's identity for financial gain?" Mom hesitated, her hands shaking just slightly. "Absolutely. My husband handled all the financial matters. I don't even know how these rumors started. I could almost feel Ryan watching me, waiting for a reaction. I didn't give him one." When the segment ended, the screen shifted to Dad. Richard Carson sat at his office desk framed by dark wood and expensive art. His voice was steady, controlled. "We will be pursuing legal action for defamation," he said. "My family's reputation has been unfairly damaged." Reputation. Always that word. I turned off the TV. "They're still performing," I said. Ryan looked at me carefully. "They don't know how not to." That evening, the police arrived at my parents' home. Jason Lee had followed through on his quiet promise. I didn't see it in person. I didn't need to. Ava sent me photos from outside the gated driveway. Officers carrying boxes of documents, folders, hard drives. My father standing on the porch, his jaw set tight. My mother pale and shaking, trying to stop the cameras from getting too close. The next morning, the knock on my door startled me. I opened it to find Mark standing there, dressed in the same suit from the wedding. His tie loosened dark circles under his eyes. He looked broken in a way I'd never seen. "Can I come in?" Ryan stepped out of the kitchen, giving me a look, then quietly left the room. Mark stood there for a long time, saying nothing. Then finally, "I didn't know. Emily." "I swear to God, I didn't know." I crossed my arms. "You didn't ask either. I thought they were exaggerating. I thought you were overreacting. I just wanted to keep the peace. You wanted to keep the illusion," I said softly. "And now it's shattered." He sank into a chair, rubbing his face. "They're losing everything. Dad's being investigated. Mom can't leave the house without reporters showing up. It's a mess. Maybe that's what the truth looks like when you've spent your life hiding from it." Mark looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't," I said. "You just stop pretending it's not broken." He nodded slowly, eyes glassy like a man finally seeing the smoke after years of living in a burning house. That night, I got another message from Claire. "Jason is filing the report officially. He says the contract from the bank shows your father's signature on your digital ID verification. It's airtight." I forwarded the message to my personal email, then shut off my phone. Meanwhile, at the Carson house, the story was playing out in real time. Jason stood in their study, flipping through pages of evidence, his gloved hand pointing to the signature line on the resort contract. "This one here," he said to the officers beside him, "matches the account verification used for the fraudulent transactions." Mark was there too. I knew because later he told me about it. The moment he saw the papers, the moment the truth became undeniable. "Dad," he'd said quietly, holding the file, "tell me this isn't real." Richard didn't answer. He just stared at the wall. "Dad." Still nothing. Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Richard say something, but he couldn't. The sound that broke the silence wasn't his voice. It was the sharp crystalline shatter of a wine glass slipping from Mark's hand and hitting the marble floor. He told me later that the sound felt like something inside him breaking too. By then I was already gone from Santa Monica, driving up the coast as the sun went down. The ocean stretched beside me, endless and indifferent golden lights spilling over the water. I didn't look back once. Behind me, the headlines kept multiplying, the voices getting louder, the facade finally cracking. But for the first time in my life, the noise didn't belong to me. It belonged to them. A month later, the storm had settled into something quieter, colder, the kind of silence that follows a collapse. The headlines had faded, replaced by newer scandals, but the damage was done. The Portland Bank Consortium released a statement: Richard Carson has been suspended from all advisory duties, pending further investigation into allegations of credit fraud. I read the email from Claire while sitting at my kitchen table, the morning light dull and pale. Her message was short. It's official. He's under review. Everything's moving according to the legal process. I closed my laptop and let the words sink in. It wasn't joy I felt, just an ache that sat somewhere between relief and grief. Across town, the house on Alder Street no longer looked like the home I grew up in. The photos online showed it shuttered and dark, the once proud lawn untrimmed, the gate locked. Neighbors whispered when they walked by. The family that had once hosted charity dinners and holiday galas now avoided the outside world. Mom had been removed from the West Hills Women's Association. Her piano students stopped showing up. A friend of hers called the school last week asking for my address. I told the receptionist not to give it out. That night, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, though I didn't need to see it to know. Emily. Dad's voice began after the tone. I know things got out of hand, but we're still family. Can we please talk like adults, like a family should? I listened twice before deleting it. His voice sounded smaller now, thinner, stripped of the authority it used to hold. At school the next day, the halls were alive with the noise of spring. My students didn't care about my family's scandal. They cared about prom graduation summer. It was a gift, that kind of teenage oblivion. During third period, Lily raised her hand. Miss Carson? Are you okay? She asked. I smiled. I'm fine, Lily. Just a little tired. You don't look tired, she said. You look calm. That made me smile for real. Sometimes calm is just what happens when you stop pretending everything's perfect. After class, as I packed up my papers, I saw him, Mark, waiting by the chain-link fence outside the school parking lot. His posture was hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. In his hand was a paper cup of coffee from the cafe down the street. My favorite kind, black 1 sugar. I walked over slowly. He handed me the cup, without a word. You didn't have to come, I said. I did, he said quietly. His hair was messier than I'd ever seen it, his eyes red-rimmed. I lost the biggest client we had. The investors pulled out after the story. Sophia's back in L.A. with her parents. She says she needs time. I nodded. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't be. You were right. They used us both, just in different ways. The wind carried the sound of students laughing somewhere behind us. He looked down at the asphalt kicking at a pebble. I should have protected you, he said. I saw what they were doing, and I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that it was just how our family worked. But I knew. You don't need to apologize for them, I said. I'm not, he replied. I'm apologizing for me. We stood there for a moment, 2 adults, who had finally stepped outside the walls our parents built. I never wanted them to lose everything, I said softly. I just couldn't let them keep everything because I stayed silent. He looked at me, his expression full of something that might have been admiration or sorrow, maybe both. They don't know who you are anymore, he said. They never did. I answered. That evening I drove home along the same road I'd taken 1,000 times before. The clouds hung low, pressing against the skyline. I passed the old family house without meaning to. It was instinct, like muscle memory. The gate was closed, the mailbox overflowing. Through the front window I saw movement, a shape I recognized instantly. Mom stood near the piano, her hands resting on the keys, though no music came. Behind her, the curtains were drawn, the room dim. For a moment I thought she might see me, but she didn't. The next morning another message from Claire, formal summons issued. They'll have to appear in court next month. Jason says the evidence is irrefutable. I didn't reply right away. I just stared at the email, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. At noon, I got a call from an unknown number again. I let it ring out. Later, I listened to the voicemail. Dad's voice was quiet this time, almost shaking. They delivered a summons. The police were here. I don't know what to say anymore. There was a long pause and then, you win. Emily, I hope it was worth it. I ended the message halfway through. Winning wasn't what this was about. It never had been. Somewhere in West Hills I knew he was standing in that same study where I once overheard everything, the room where his empire had started to crack. The officers would be walking out with their folders, the front door open for the first time in weeks. Mom would be by the window, her hand pressed against the glass, watching them leave. Her face pale, the lines around her mouth deeper now. Maybe she'd cry. Maybe she wouldn't. I'd never know for sure. What I did know was that for the first time the house would finally be silent. No piano, no laughter, no pretending. Just the echo of everything they'd built collapsing into the quiet they used to fear. 2 months later, everything that used to define the Carson name had come undone. The glossy features in business magazines were gone, replaced by news briefs buried beneath newer scandals. Carson Financial Group loses major investors. Following family fraud probe, former banker faces civil lawsuit. Over identity theft allegations. The headlines were smaller now, but the wreckage was real. Mark's company folded quietly at the end of July. He called to tell me it was over, his voice heavy and flat. The investors pulled out, he said. No one wants to be associated with the name Carson anymore. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the hollow sound of someone packing up the remnants of a life. Sophia filed for separation last week, he added, barely above a whisper. She said she can't rebuild her career while everyone still thinks she's part of a fraud. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing left to soften the truth. I'm sorry, I finally said. He laughed, a small, tired sound. Don't be. You didn't destroy anything. You just revealed what was already cracked. After we hung up, I sat in my tiny apartment, sunlight spilling across the table, and opened my laptop for my first online class of the summer. My students filled the screen in small digital squares, their faces lit by morning light. I smiled, asked how their week had been, and listened as they talked about college plans and summer jobs. The world kept moving. When the session ended, I closed my computer and leaned back in my chair. The quiet felt different now, less oppressive, more like space to breathe. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of traffic below the smell of fresh coffee. It all reminded me that life had continued while my family's empire fell apart. I thought I'd feel vindicated. I thought the day they lost everything would bring some kind of satisfaction, but it didn't. I only felt empty. They had turned love into currency, and in the end, the investment had gone bankrupt. Later that week, the Portland Chronicle ran another headline, West Hills Mansion listed for sale. Amid ongoing legal disputes, the listing photos were clinical. Bright rooms, marble floors, and no trace of life. I recognized every corner of that house, but it didn't look like home anymore. It looked like evidence. That night, as rain pattered softly against the windows, my phone rang. Ava's name lit up the screen. I just spoke to your mother, she said without preamble. She wants to issue a public apology. She's written a letter. She asked if I'd publish it. I felt my stomach tighten. And you're calling to ask if I'm okay with it. Yes, Ava said. She doesn't want to do it without your consent. She said it's not about clearing her name. It's about owning what she did. I didn't answer right away. My mind drifted back to the last time I'd seen my mother. The shimmer of her gold dress under the California sun, the frozen smile, the way she'd looked at me like I was a stranger at her table. I don't need an apology, I said finally. But maybe someone else does. What do you mean to publish it, I said. Not for me. For the women who read it and recognize themselves in it. For anyone who's ever been treated like a burden and told it was love. Ava exhaled softly. I thought you'd say that. The next morning she emailed me the draft. I hesitated before opening it, afraid of what I might find inside. The letter began simply, to my daughter, and to those I've wronged, without realizing it. I stopped reading. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the strange weight of seeing the words my daughter written by her. For so long, I'd felt like that title didn't belong to me. I took a breath and kept going. I spent my life teaching my children that love meant sacrifice and discipline. But somewhere along the way, I confused control with care. I thought protecting our family's image was the same as protecting its soul. I see now how wrong I was. I paused again. My throat felt tight. I wasn't sure if the emotion swelling in me was forgiveness or something softer, quieter. Recognition, maybe? The letter continued, recounting how she'd ignored my boundaries, how she'd mistaken my silence for obedience. She ended with, I hope that one day Emily can remember me, not for what I tried to build, but for what I finally learned to let go of. I set my phone down and stared out the window. The sky was overcast, but the light had a strange warmth to it. Ryan came in from the kitchen. You okay? He asked. She wrote it. I said, she actually wrote it. He handed me a cup of coffee, sat beside me, and said nothing. I read the letter one more time, slower this time, letting each line settle. The words weren't perfect, but they were honest in a way I'd never seen from her before. And maybe honesty was the first step toward something new. When I finished, I pressed my thumb against the rim of the cup and whispered. For once, she didn't hide behind the mask. Ava texted a few minutes later. It'll run tomorrow morning, full page. I typed back, thank you. After she confirmed, I looked at the copy of the letter again. My hands shook slightly, not from rage, but from the realization that this was the first time my mother had ever said she was wrong, and meant it. Outside, the rain stopped. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement, reflecting something that almost looked like hope. That morning in October, the front page of the Portland Tribune was quieter than usual. No headlines in bold red, no breaking scandal banners, just a simple black and white title, centered above a full-page letter. From a mother. I was drinking coffee before class when Ava's text came through. It's live. I clicked the link, and there it was. The first line read, I once taught my daughter that love meant control. I was wrong. When she stopped speaking, I finally heard what I'd never understood. The words were simple, but they hit like thunder in slow motion. The kind of truth that only comes from losing everything. As I scrolled, my breath caught on another line. I confused fear with protection, pride with strength. I raised my children to succeed, but forgot to teach them to feel safe in failure. To my daughter, I owe a debt no apology can pay. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. The classroom clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, clouds rolled in over the Willamette gray and heavy, like they might finally break open. By noon, the letter was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, online forums. Screens filled with screenshots of her handwriting shared thousands of times. The comments were different this time. She finally said what so many mothers never do. This isn't just her story. It's ours. I was Emily once. I kept quiet because I thought silence was love. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just sat there reading as strangers found pieces of themselves in our broken family. When my students came in for afternoon homeroom, they were buzzing about something unrelated. College applications, Halloween costumes, normal teenage chaos. It was a relief to sink into that noise. Halfway through class, Lily raised her hand again. Ms. Carson. Yes. She hesitated, her brow furrowed like she was thinking too hard for someone her age. Do you think people can love again after they've been hurt? The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. Finally, I looked out the window where the sky hung low and pale. Yes, I said quietly, but not the same way. You don't go back to who you were. You learn how to love without forgetting. She nodded slowly as if she understood more than most adults would. When the bell rang, the students rushed out, leaving behind the faint smell of pencils and rain-soaked jackets. I lingered at my desk gathering papers when the school secretary poked her head through the door. Package for you, she said, smiling. Came by courier. I thanked her and took the brown parcel. The handwriting on the label stopped me cold. Elegant, familiar, looping in the way she used to sign holiday cards. Eleanor Carson. I didn't open it right away. I waited until the building was quiet, the afternoon sun slipping through the blinds in narrow lines. When I finally untied the string, a copy of the newspaper slid out folded neatly. Inside it was an envelope, cream-colored with my name written in blue ink. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Emily. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you know I've learned something from you. You showed me what love looks like when it has no conditions. I see now that silence isn't weakness. It's where courage begins. I was too proud to listen, too afraid to admit that my daughter had more strength than I ever did. That was my failure, not yours. If you ever choose to visit, the door will be open. If not, I understand. This letter isn't to pull you back. It's to set you free. Love, Mom. I read it once. Then again. Then I folded it carefully and set it on the desk beside me. My hands didn't shake anymore. There were no tears, just a deep, quiet stillness that spread through my chest like air finally reaching a room long sealed shut. Outside, the wind had picked up. I stepped out into the courtyard behind the school, the one that overlooked the soccer field. The students were running, shouting, laughing. the kind of sound that made the world feel alive again. I closed my eyes and let the cool air brush against my face. For the first time in years, the weight I'd carried didn't feel like it was pressing down anymore. It was simply gone. The bell rang again, echoing across the empty hallways. I turned back toward the building, the letter still in my hand, and whispered to the wind. "You finally said it, Mom." Then I slipped the letter into my bag, walked back inside, and let the day carry me forward, light, steady, unburdened. Spring came early that year, soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look forgiven. I'd been living by the Columbia River for almost a year. Just me, the sound of water, and a small white house with creaky floors, and windows that caught the sunrise. Every morning I brewed coffee, opened the curtains, and watched the light spill across the water like it was erasing what had come before. That morning I saw a familiar car pull into the gravel driveway. Mark stepped out first, looking older but lighter somehow. The passenger door opened and Mom followed. She moved slower these days, careful with each step, but her eyes were steady. Behind them in the driver's seat, I saw Dad. He didn't get out. He just sat there, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the river like it might hold an answer. Mom was holding a small bouquet of lavender. "I heard you like this scent," she said. Her voice soft, uncertain. "I do," I said. I opened the door wider. "Come in." She looked relieved but nervous, her eyes darting around the small living room. It wasn't much. Bookshelves, a worn rug, the faint smell of coffee and wood polish, but it felt honest. Mark carried a tray of pastries from a bakery downtown. "Peace offering," he said, smiling faintly. We sat around the small kitchen table, the sunlight slanting through the windows. I poured tea instead of coffee. None of us said much. There were no apologies left to make no explanations that hadn't already been written spoken, or thought 100 times. Instead, we talked about small things, how Mark had started consulting again, how Mom had taken up gardening, how the lilacs were blooming early this year. She mentioned almost shyly that she'd started teaching piano again. "Just 2 students," she said. "Kids who remind me of you when you were little. They make mistakes and laugh about it. I think that's good." I smiled. "It is." When the tea ran out, we stood and walked outside. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. Mom paused on the porch, looking out at the river. "It's beautiful here," she said. "It's quiet," I replied. "That's what I needed." She nodded. "You always did find peace in silence. I used to think that meant you were shutting me out. Now I think maybe you were just finding your way back to yourself." Her words caught me off guard. I didn't answer, but I reached out and touched her arm lightly. It was enough. Mark hugged me before they left, holding on just a little longer than usual. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "but it took a long time to believe that." He smiled sadly. "We're still learning." When their car pulled away, I stood on the porch watching until it disappeared around the bend. Dad never got out, but before they turned, he lifted one hand in a small, almost hesitant wave. I lifted mine too. That was enough. Inside the house was filled with the scent of lavender. On the counter, Mom had left one sprig beside her empty teacup. I picked it up, twirling it between my fingers, then set it in a small glass by the window. Later that afternoon, as the light shifted toward gold, I opened the old wooden box I'd kept tucked away since I moved here. Inside were fragments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Photos, letters, a report card the watch Dad gave me when I graduated college. At the bottom was a single photograph our family years ago, smiling in front of the old house before everything cracked. For a long time I'd kept that picture hidden, but now as I looked at it, I didn't see the lies anymore. I saw what we were trying to be, and maybe that was enough too. I placed it carefully on the bookshelf in the living room beside my favorite novel, and the small ceramic bird one of my students made for me last Christmas. Outside, the river shimmered in the fading light. I stepped onto the porch, the boards warm under my bare feet. The air was still cool, but the kind that hinted summer was coming. Karma isn't revenge. It's balance restored in its own time. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped protecting them from their own consequences. The sun slipped lower, the water catching every color of gold and blue. I closed my eyes, breathing in the lavender-scented air, and felt something shift inside. A quiet, steady peace that no one could take this time. I used to hear them say I deserved to pay, and in a way I did. But what they never understood was that so did they, each of us paying for what we valued most. I smiled, the river wind brushing against my face, my hair lifting slightly in the breeze. And maybe, just maybe, this was what freedom sounded like. If you've ever been underestimated, don't waste your breath proving your worth. Live so fully that your silence becomes the loudest echo in the room. Share your story if you've ever won quietly. #TheSilentPower.